This is Jeremy Smith with TeacherCast. We're going to be interviewing two teachers today. The first one is Dr. Dana Holland, and the second one is Professor Sylvain Vachon. Dr. Dana Holland couldn't make it for a live interview, so I've given her the questions and she's responded in order. Here's Dr. Dana Holland.
My name is Dr. Dana Holland, and I currently teach at the University of Toledo. Right now, I am teaching under the Academic Affairs Department, and I exclusively teach the student athletes. The subject areas are pretty varied. They can be anything from English as a second language to business to geology to anything really, psychology, sociology, education. I'm just rattling them off as I'm remembering them. But yeah, it's pretty varied. Last semester, I was the instructor on record for child development for early childhood educators as well. The academic level that I teach at is technically higher education, as in, university level. However, a lot of my students are not actually at that level, but that's another story. Okay, second question here. What standards do I use for my class and level, Common Core, that kind of stuff? It depends. For the course that I taught last year, it was a tag course, which meant that that particular course was transferable completely to any Ohio State school. So basically, the state of Ohio gave me a list of competencies that each student had to fulfill in order to, graduate from that course, right? It was part of a teacher certification program. So I had those standards / competencies, which incidentally did look they were in that Common Core format, but it wasn't actually the Common Core because they're not high school students. Besides that, other standards for teaching that particular course, it was something that really, it was just relying a bit on those Ohio standards as well as just the students' demonstrated competency of the material. So I guess we can get more into that later. How do I get these standards? For the Ohio tag course, obviously it was handed down from, the state of Ohio Department of Education. So there was that. As far as other standards go, having the PhD in Theoretical Social Foundations of Education, you kind of develop your own sort of pedagogical practices, so I think it's just a little mix of everything, really. For what I do now with the Athletic Affairs Division, there's no Ohio State standards or anything like that for the athletes or anything, but for them, it kind of goes down to demonstrated competencies and whatnot. So it's very individualistic, and it just has a lot to do with the whole teacher-student relationship driven, if that makes any sense. We'll have to get more into this later. Do I collaborate with others? I collaborate with others all the time, and it is highly necessary. There are professors out there who don't, and A, they drive me nuts, and B, they're not usually very well, received. You know what I mean? It's just not. The more open you are as an educator, the better you do. If you think it's only your way, the highway, everybody suffers because you end up driving yourself nuts, and your students drive you nuts, and your students will often drive your administration nuts. So really, it's kind of a lose-lose to just sort of have that whole my way or the highway attitude. It's not fun for anybody. And plus, in collaborating with others, we all learn from each other. There's a phrase that goes, when one teaches, two learn. And I really believe that. Even as educators, we learn so much from our students. All the time it happens, in fact, with me. So, yeah, collaboration is extremely important. Do I use Bloom's taxonomy? I don't. I don't really care for it, to be honest. I am a little bit of a mix between people like Paulo Freire, John Dewey, Howard Gardner, that's with his multiple intelligences theory, Piaget, but I can't remember his first name, and Vygotsky. I'd say I'm a hodgepodge of all those people, and then some, obviously. Before I sit down on lesson plan, what thoughts go through my mind? Student ability or standard? Before I sit down on lesson plan, for me, I'm very student-centered. I think about the students and what works best with them and how they're going to get the most out of whatever I'm trying to impart. Because to me, I don't really like the whole banking model of education, which has that disparity of power between the teacher and student, saying that the teacher is just going to deposit this information into the empty student, and there's that whole power dynamic, and I don't subscribe to that, because each student has their own very valuable thoughts and experiences and knowledge that is completely their own, and they can use those things to access the new information. Really, I think of it more like I'm a facilitator of their learning experience, because that's really what I try to do. I facilitate their learning. I don't spoon feed them. I don't lecture at them. I don't write on the board a whole lot. None of that stuff. I'm facilitating their learning experience. And we can go into like how and what I do a little bit later. But yeah, short answer, no, I don't like Bloom's taxonomy really. And the thoughts that are going through my mind when I'm lesson planning are mostly student-centered. What is my group like? How do they learn the best? Are they going to like the material that I'm trying to get through? And if not, how can I, get them through it in the most fun, engaging, and memorable, and that's the most important one, memorable way possible? How can I give them a learning experience that they're going to take away from and really remember that, down the line? Because I don't want to be one of those professors or have one of those classes where they don't even remember what they did in class. I want them to be like, oh yeah, I remember Dr. Holland's class. We did that thing one time, da 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 da. That's what I want. And I guess the thought process begins again with the student. What are their needs? What are they best at? All of that goes together. And next one. How important are lessons plans? Lesson plans are critically important, I would say. I mean, I'm kind of a thorough planning person anyway, but I don't know how you could not have a lesson plan. Though I guess it depends on what you're trying to teach, content matter wise. I guess maybe if it's a foreign language, you might not need a lesson plan as much, I guess. Not really though. I honestly can't even conceive of that, because even if you don't have a lesson plan, I mean, it just seems like it would be stressful for no reason. So not only do I have lesson plans, but I'll have backup lesson plans because sometimes you'll have a lesson plan and it's just not working, and that's okay. You can make a lesson plan that just doesn't jive with everybody. Like maybe it'll jive with one group and not with another group, and that's fine. So you just go to the backups. I like to have at least one backup and honestly, 2 backups are really good. And sometimes, if we're really lucky, which is pretty rare, you'll get through the lesson and all the stuff that you need to do like early, but you don't want to let them go early. So you incorporate the backup lesson plan as well. So yeah, lesson plans are pretty critical, at least to me. Could I use only a few a semester? Lord, no. I mean, my class last year, I almost said last semester, met, was it twice a week? I think it was twice a week. And yeah, I had a lesson plan for each day. I mean, and all the backup lesson plans and all that too. Now, it's the same deal. I'll have a lesson plan for each day, for each particular group, because I have an extremely diverse group at Larimer, at the Academic Affairs Department. I had no idea how diverse our athletes were. So, yeah, that's really quite the experience. Is it difficult to stick to lesson plans? If so, how do you combat that? I think it depends on a lot of different things. I mean, it's a little too vague. If the question is it difficult to stick to like the material or the original plan? I mean, it all just kind of depends on the group and how you're trying to convey that information. And how inflexible you are, I think. Because say you're trying to get through a lesson plan in one particular style. If that doesn't jive for everybody and they're just like, oh my God, we want to go jump out the window, then if you're just going to try to stick to that original plan, then it's going to suck. So it's just, I don't really see the point of doing it that way. If everybody is like about to pass out, then you need to switch it up. But I don't think that's a difficulty in sticking to the lesson plan. I think that's just plans change. You can't always plan for that. And sometimes, they'll just be tired. Sometimes they're moody. Sometimes they're hungry, whatever. But actually, that's a good point, that last one. Especially for morning classes. I'm a really big believer in the fact that, or in the idea that, everything that's going on in your background affects how you learn. And you can't learn when you're hungry. I mean, that's in fact, you can't really do anything well when you're hungry. So, and I know that, I know what it's like to be a poor college student, and, especially a young one, and it's pretty terrible. So I always made sure that every class I would bring some sort of food. Usually I stuck to like bananas or oranges or just something that was like easy. If I had a guest speaker, I'd bring donuts, to be fancy. But yeah, I always made sure to bring food, because that way they were so much more engaged, they were awake, and they weren't hungry. They could pay attention to me. And it really made all the difference. There were a couple times when I was running late and I couldn't bring food, and oh my God, it was just terrible. And I mean, they weren't mean about it, of course. They weren't like, oh, where's our food? But it just kind of showed in their behavior because they couldn't focus as well. They just weren't all there. So that really does make a difference, even with the athletes, actually. Have I ever had to scrap a lesson plan because students couldn't keep up? I wouldn't say I had to scrap it because students couldn't keep up so much as it going back to the differing learning styles. Like if I'm trying to teach something in a certain way and it's not getting through, then I need to change whatever I'm doing, right? There's another phrase that goes, if students do not learn the way we teach, then we must teach them the way that they learn, right? And that has kind of a dual meaning, because A, they have to learn how they're learning, and B, we have to teach them in ways that are congruent with their learning styles. It's just, I mean, you can go against them, but it's not really nice or fair to anybody. So, no, I've never had to like really scrap a lesson plan because of that, but I have had to change styles up because, you just do. And again, sometimes it could be mood. It could be anything. But yeah, I don't know how helpful that was. How do you plan for diversity and disabilities and stuff? Let's see. For me, but I don't like to do anything unless I know my audience. Now, if I'm giving like a seminar or some sort of talk or something, I mean, that's one thing. Well, actually, no, even then I have to know about my audience. But really, I always am planning for my audience. I'm thinking about all the different people and learning styles and abilities in the room, and using communication styles and strategies that help everybody. As for disabilities, it's really the same thing. The university, as well as probably every other university and probably every other compulsory education institution, has a disability services department, And they, they'll arrange for like note takers, and I actually have no idea what else they arrange for. But they make accommodations through them. But yeah, I had a couple students with disabilities in my classroom last year. And what I did was I met with the students individually, privately, not announcing it to the whole class, asking them what kind of accommodations they would like to have, what could I do, that would best help them and all that fun stuff. And, good to go, no issues. And there's another thing that I learned actually from a, special education teacher. And that was that if you make accommodations for a student, usually those accommodations will help everybody. And I found that to be true, because the accommodations that I had to make last semester were that I would just basically kind of write up running notes about what we did in class and the lessons I was trying to impart and how it went and stuff, and I would post them on the website. And everybody really liked that, and it really helped everyone, honestly. So, I mean, of course it depends on the accommodation, right? So if it's, say, sign language, I mean, that's not going to help everybody. But, little things like that really helped everybody. And as for diversity and all of that fun stuff, again, I'm always planning for my audience, trying to tailor everything that I'm trying to say to them. So, how often am I observed and all that fun stuff? When I was teaching last year, I think I was observed twice. I think I was officially observed twice. But I often had guest speakers, and I would have people that I would bring in from the outside, and we would work like on different things. I'm a really big fan of co-teaching, because if nothing else, honestly, it keeps the students so interested, and it's really fun. So whenever I was, co-teaching with somebody, after the fact, we would always, kind of have a debriefing and say how it went, and, feedback and all that fun stuff. So that was at least once a month that I would do that. And again, the official observations, I think, were twice. It might have been three times, but I'm not 100% sure. How often do I reuse lesson plans? Like for the same group, it depends on what it is. Like, if it's an activity, I don't really reuse them, not with the same group. I mean, I'll reuse the same lesson plans in general, like, all the time. But I can't do that with, like, the same group. It's kind of like, taking somebody out to see the same movie. It's just, you don't do that. And plus, it wouldn't really work. Now, I mean, there are a few things that you can reuse. Like, if you're familiar with Kahoot, it's that, it's kind of like a little online Jeopardy thing. We would do Kahoots before every exam. And so, I mean, stuff like that, but that's more of a review. That I would reuse with the same group. But otherwise, no, everything was pretty different. But a lot of my lesson plans and activities and stuff, I reuse them all the time. It's fantastic. And plus, collaborating with others, we learn about, new activities and new ideas and new strategies. And it's great. If you don't collaborate, you don't get access to any of that. Pointers for new teachers in reference to lesson plans. I think the biggest advice, or the most important thing, is that you collaborate. It doesn't matter how experienced you are, honestly, because you're always going to hear a new idea. And if nothing else, there's always these new immersion technologies that we can be making use of. I didn't know about Kahoot until I heard about it, and it was really useful. I mean, even if you stay up on all the new trends yourself, it's difficult, because, I mean, you can try things out yourself, and that's great, but isn't it better to hear the tried and true story of, another teacher, et cetera, et cetera? So I'd say collaborating is probably the most important. You show what you're doing to somebody else with more experience, or even the same amount of experience, because 2 eyes are always better than 1, 2 heads are better than 1, and that other person could catch something, or they could have a nice, really helpful suggestion and then everybody has benefited. I think the other really big important thing to remember is to have backup lesson plans, because if you do not have a backup lesson plan and you either get through your first one too quick or it doesn't work for anybody else, then you're like, you can't just be a deer in headlights. So having a backup is extremely, extremely important. And if you don't use it, then use it another day. It doesn't matter. There is no, time limit unless it's something that is weather permitting. And even then, there's always going to be another time. So, I hope I got through everything that you needed. If not, or you want me to elaborate on more things, because I could speak to this to no end. If you want to know anything else about education or teaching plans or teaching styles or learning styles or anything, just let me know and I'll be happy to answer them.
The second teacher is a professor from Yongsan International School in Seoul, Korea. Take it away, Sylvain Vachon.
Okay, and we're on. Okay, could you tell me your name, where you teach, what subject, and what level you teach?
I'm Sylvain. I teach at Yongsan International School of Seoul. I'm a high school French teacher.
Excellent, thank you. And what standards do you use for your class and for your level?
So we use something called the Kentucky World Languages Standards from the state of Kentucky. We apply them across all world languages and then make our objectives more specific to those standards as in our target language.
Oh, excellent. Is there a reason you use this standard as opposed to something like Common Core, or is it a preference of the school, or could you speak on that if you know?
Well, we could choose what we'd like. So we use Common Core in some other classes, particularly math and English, and I think science. But for world languages, we decided on something like this. We presented it to the school once we agreed to it as a department, and they allowed us to do it. So as an entire department, we've decided to step away from it. And if I understand correctly, Common Core is essentially English and math standards with perhaps some science ones. As far as I know, they don't have world languages standards.
Gotcha. I didn't know that myself, so thank you. um, Now, when you get these standards, you said you chose them. Now, do you collaborate with the other language teachers in unpacking them, or is this a solo activity?
I don't, because I'm the only French teacher in my department. The Spanish teachers would, because there's three of them, and there's two Mandarin teachers and two Korean teachers. So they would collaborate insofar as scope and sequence, what is covered first, what is covered second, what is reviewed later on. But in my case, I'm the one who unpacks them all.
I gotcha. Okay. Do you have any ambiguous standards that you've come across, or if so, what do you do with them?
Well, by nature, world language standards are vague because they apply to a broad range of languages. So, for example, we don't necessarily have specific standards towards conjugation of tenses because there are languages like Mandarin that have no conjugations at all. So they're I wouldn't say they're ambiguous, but they're generally vague and they aim towards a particular level of proficiency. What I have to do when I read one of those is I have to then use my own objectives to specify the standard and say, this is how you will meet the standard by using the lesson's objectives. So a textbook or some resource that I'm using to teach the class. So in Teach Now, one of the standards I unpack is reading, and it's a novice low reading, so they're just recognizing a few words and they could recognize the alphabet. It's vague. It's not necessarily ambiguous, but it's vague. It's unspecific. I then say, well, you're going to have to be able to read greetings because you always learn how to say hello. That's usually the first thing you learn. You're going to have to be able to read statements about your health because that's usually the second thing we ask. Hello, and then how are you? How are you doing? And because of French, the how are you doing and where are you going is actually the same verb. I've then added on that same verb and saying you're going to be able to tell people about your destination. So you're going to have to be able to differentiate using that same verb that you'll be able to recognize, but are you telling me how you're doing? Are you telling me about where you're going? That is how I take a vague standard and make it more specific so that the kids know exactly what I'm looking for.
That works nicely actually because you get the standard that's vague for a purpose, like in languages, and I've not had to deal with a lot of vague standards. I don't use Common Core. I'm given a book and then a pacing lesson, and that's pretty much it. So interesting you talked about that. So in Teach Now we're learning about Bloom's taxonomy. Do you use this when you unpack a standard, or is it in the back of your mind, or is it even come into your view? Could you speak on that?
Over the long run, over the course of 4 years, perhaps, but because we're starting to learn a language from zero in the target language, I can't really get the kids to think about a topic critically before they've actually learned the language. So you want to have, the highest end of Bloom's taxonomy, but those would be for the more advanced kids. And even then, it won't be as advanced as in their mother tongue. So it's not a conscious process in the actual lesson plan because I'm still teaching them how to speak.
Okay. So
later on in the more advanced levels, then ideally I'd be able to apply it. But it depends on how well these kids are doing and how they've progressed through their time with me in the department.
Right. So that would be French 4 or possibly French 3 if they're more advanced, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that works. Now let's move on to the lesson planning. For you, how important are lesson plans? Are they essential, like daily, or are they more or less guidelines? Could you feasibly teach a semester on only a few lesson plans, or do you need like a daily plotted out course?
I've looked at Teach Now's template. I don't plan it that thoroughly throughout for a single lesson. But what I do have is I have every single day. So I teach kids. So I'll repeat that.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon.
No
I
worries.
teach kids in a block schedule. I get them for 85 minutes every other day for about 80 days out of the year. So those 80 days are planned out with, here are the activities I want to do to sort of pace ourselves and give me an idea of how much we're going to cover, give the students an idea of how much we're going to cover. So they're not as thorough as the Teach Now template. That's essentially 2 pages, but they are geared towards our particular objectives contained in the textbook and in the Atlas Rubicon that we use that lists all of the standards, those Kentucky standards that I was telling you about. So I take my objectives and insert them into the Atlas Rubicon. And there are times where the standards are met several times. Beginning reading, beginner writing, we don't breeze through those. We'll sometimes take weeks to perfect the lower levels of literacy and get pronunciation done in the oral assessments, get pronunciation correctly, because there are vowels that you mispronounce it and it changes the meaning of the word and thus causes miscomprehension or misunderstandings. We take our time to review those standards over several weeks, the same standards, before moving on to something more advanced, from a novice low to a novice middle. In the
Give that extra repetition and extra practice is essential for the basics when you're first starting out. Because if you're into French 2,
right.
Yeah, and you're mispronouncing the same words, then you've learned it wrong, and you have a much harder time going back. So
right. So I start with, here's what they're going to have to learn, and then I decide what's the best way to engage them in learning this, to get them to speak the language, to get them to read the language, to get them to write the language. And then I work away from there. Most people call it backwards mapping. I think it's forward thinking. It's backwards from a student's perspective, but from my perspective, I start where the treasure is, and then I map my way out of the cave, rather than going into the cave and trying to figure out where I'm supposed to hide this treasure. Maps usually point us to our destination. But if you've already been at the destination and you're going to go pick someone up, you're going forwards and then taking them back to where you've been. That's where it starts. The games, the the activities, the workbook exercises, the readings, all of that then comes out of what are they supposed to learn? What is the objective first that is aligned with the more broad world languages standard? I work from there out, and then I meet the kids at the easiest spot and then increase it in difficulty until they could actually meet the objective. And then once they meet enough of those objectives within the standard over those few weeks, then I say, all right, you're able to meet the basic levels of, let's say, literacy in the example I've used previously. Now we could move on to something a little more advanced in literacy.
Oh, that's an interesting way of teaching. I've not had any experience in doing that. Like I said earlier, I'm given a book, and I pace it out, to the end of the semester. So it can be a big change for me when I actually start making lesson plans. So, but thank you for that insight and that analogy. That was really interesting. The next question: when you execute a lesson plan, do you find yourself taking a lot of notes and modifying it, or do you stick to the lesson plan kind of like in a concrete manner?
No, I don't take a lot of notes. Insofar as modifying it, I'll only modify something that has flopped. I'll modify something that hasn't worked despite the best preparations. I'm always trying to set my students up to succeed. The activities that we do and the standards that we do, the objectives that they have to meet, the things they have to say, and they're expected to be able to read and write what they've been able to say. I'll modify something that hasn't worked, that has simply flopped, that it's not helped them meet the objective. But insofar as taking notes and all of those things while I teach, no, there's enough data collection that happens through testing, through the flipped classroom web app that I use that collects right and wrong answers, and I get a general overview of what the kids understand before I even get to my lesson, and then I can gauge what I have, which standard, which objective I must emphasize, and which are the other ones that they got a little more easily, and therefore we don't have to emphasize as much. It's almost coming naturally to the kids.
Okay. You just mentioned earlier about lesson plan flopping. Have you ever had to scrap a lesson plan? And could you speak to that? Was it more on the part of you planned it, your planning was too advanced for what they were able to do, or the students were disinterested, or could you think back to a time where one did flop? And could you talk about that for me?
I never had a lesson plan flop. I have had activities that simply proved useless or simply too difficult to explain and have them do it. I remember I had one where the directions were clear, but I guess the material was, they didn't understand why it was two-sided and why there was one side with a word and another side with a picture, and why they didn't match. And I was explaining to them that we're practicing reflexive verbs, and you have to practice the pronoun that goes with the reflexive, because it changes depending on who is doing it, and it didn't work. And I tried it with 3 different French classes, even with my more advanced classes, to see if they could understand it, and the activity didn't meet the objective. So I scrapped that activity, had to rethink it, and then adjust the lesson plan accordingly. But I've never had a lesson plan not work.
Okay. So do you have a group of like activities you can go to? Like, for example, this one flopped. Okay, well, they're not getting it. Let's move on to something else. I do have
several activities. I have, for example, like a type of Connect 5 based on the game Connect 4. I've got an SOS based on that game. I use those for verb conjugations and to practice their numbers. There's a grid with a whole bunch of numbers on it, and then they have verbs at the top, and on the far left they have personal pronouns, I, you, he, she, it, they, and all of those, and they practice conjugating the verbs, and they practice the numbers. They have to say the number they're going to do, which matches the verb and the personal pronoun. I've got games like Jeopardy that I could use online that I could create. I could create audio quizzes in Schoology and have audio clips play, and with a question and an answer, and have the kids match it, or have the kids tell me, is this the correct way to answer this question, true and false. I've got another game that is, I call it Long Live High Speed, because it practices their numbers, and it practices either a picture of a verb that I'll put on it with a number, or I'll put a picture of a thing on it with a number, and we'll practice verbs, we'll practice nouns, we'll practice menus and ordering things. You know, I want some of this, I want one of those, I want 3 of these, a dozen of those, and the kids have to recall the number that I say and then correctly tell me what's in the photo, or when I tell them what's in the photo, they then have to correctly name the number that's there. So there's a review embedded into it, as well as a learning opportunity to meet the objective. Those games tend to be really popular, so I'll go back to them, and it's easier to explain the rules for those. They're games that kids with which they're familiar. I'm always looking for new things. I'm always looking to adapt, but there is definitely a bag of tricks whereby I could simply fall back on an activity that has worked and simply change the content to meet the new objective.
Yeah, I find keeping that bag of tricks or that bag of games handy, like really, really beneficial, because at any given moment, it's like, oh, well, we don't have enough students today to do what I planned, or these are the kids that have problems with this. Okay, so let's move on to what they can do, get a review in or something like that. Yeah, good idea. Okay, do you have other teachers come and view your classes to give you feedback? Do you actively look for mentorship in your classes? But I could imagine with you being the only French teacher, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to do.
Usually it's a bit of a novelty. I do have others, like my boss has to come and see and evaluate me and notice what I'm doing, sit in the classroom. I've had other teachers come and see me, but what I do is so novel, it's so unlike a language class that they typically sit there and there isn't necessarily much feedback except to say, wow, I never thought to do something like that. My colleagues will do it. I've had colleagues from other schools, other international schools, come in and do it and interview my kids just to see how advanced their French is, how well they speak it, how well they understand difficult concepts. And I wish there'd be better feedback. I wish there were more feedback, but because what I do is rare and it's effective, it's more of I want to come and see the show rather than I hope to contribute to this individual's career. I'm hoping my Teach Now mentor during the internship, let's call it, will be able to breathe some life into what I do rather than simply look at the spectacle and wonder how I do it.
Is your mentor from Teach Now a French teacher as well?
No.
Oh.
My mentor's a math teacher,
oh.
and he's actually quite looking forward to the cross-disciplinary cooperation.
I'm considering how that's possible, math and French. It's very interesting. You can learn from all areas, though. So, for the last question, are there any pointers or suggestions that you would give a new teacher when making a lesson plan for the first time? Anything they should keep in mind or definitely look out for?
You've always got to keep the objective in mind, the standard, what it is that they're supposed to leave your class knowing. That is your focus. You have to remember that. Otherwise, you'll get lost in fun facts or fall down the rabbit hole and not be able to find yourself. That is what you must bear in mind. What is the objective, or what are the objectives for this lesson in particular? What are they? What don't they know coming in, and what do they have to know going out? Everything else has to fall from there. That is, you hang your lesson on the objective.
That works. Well, thank you so much for the insight. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This concludes the interview.
Okay. It was a pleasure. God bless.